Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar presented by Sean Miles, who joined Veramed in 2017 as a statistical programmer. Before Sean kicks off, I just wanted to mention a few housekeeping points. So if you've joined a webinar before, you'll probably realise that you are automatically muted. If you do have any technical issues or any questions throughout, you can type them into the question box, which is located on your GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be popped up on the right-hand side of your screen. Sean will present for around 20 to 25 minutes, after which he's happy to take questions. And if you do have any questions throughout or at the end of the session, again, if you just type them into your question box on your webinar toolbar, I'll be able to present those to Sean to answer at the end of the session. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Sean. Thanks, Sean.
Hi, so welcome to this webinar, everyone. This is just going to be a little insight into my role as a statistical programmer and kind of how I got here and my time here so far at Veramed. So what we're going to be talking about is first I'll give a little introduction about me and how I got into the industry, then talk a bit about how the pharmaceutical industry in general, clinical trials, and what a programmer's role within trials are. My experiences of the recruitment process, how I got my current role, and then the graduate training program I went through here and my time here so far. So to kick off, a bit about me. My background is in maths. I went to University of Reading, studied maths, and you might think of this as quite a logical thinking-y, problem-solving-y kind of discipline, in which case I'd say you're right, and it might seem quite a traditional route to programming. But what I found interesting when I came into the industry is that it was definitely not the only route that people took. There was lots of different ways people came into the industry, and I thought that was quite interesting, that I might seem like I have a traditional route in, but there's lots of people from lots of varied backgrounds, which I thought was quite interesting. So my degree did involve some programming. I wasn't the biggest fan of it throughout my degree, but obviously it hasn't put me off. And I found that learning on the job was a lot easier than the kind of bite-sized bits you get throughout your degree. So if it's not for you at the moment, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. It's a lot easier to pick up on the job, I found anyway. So as part of my degree, I did a placement year. I knew I wanted some experience. I wanted to do a placement year, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. So basically I went to see the careers person who was sorting out the placement years and said, I want to do a placement year, I want some experience, this would be good for going to the world of work as a graduate, but I don't know what I want to do. And she kind of said, what modules are you interested in? And then I really liked my module in medical statistics. So I followed this path into the pharmaceutical industry. And the role I got for my placement year was a student statistician at a pharmaceutical company. So what this involved was looking at the data from their products in the tests going on in the labs and at the clinic sites, monitoring the performance and summarising the data in reports and presentations. So throughout the year, I think I learned quite a lot about the industry and how crucial the role of stats and programming is in terms of a clinical trial. And this meant that I knew going back into my final year that it was something I wanted to do after university as a graduate role. So I'm just going to move on and talk a bit more about the industry in general. So a new drug is expensive. It's estimated that the global pharmaceutical market will reach $1.12 trillion by 2022. So that's a pretty incomprehensible number. But the point of it is that the market is growing each year. It's not going to get any smaller. It takes about 10 or so years, hundreds of millions of pounds to develop a new drug, from being a little compound in the lab to being something you might see on a shelf of a supermarket or in a pharmacy. And I think this is what makes the pharmaceutical industry so interesting. There's loads and loads of different companies who have quite complicated relationships with each other, but two traditional paths that people go down would be the pharmaceutical companies and the contract or clinical research organizations. So the relationship between these two types of companies and the companies in general will vary between companies, between studies, trials, but the main gist of it is that a pharmaceutical company would run a trial to test a drug and then would contract some parts of the running of that trial out to CROs. So for example, they might contract out the statistics and programming aspects of the trial. But how does a programmer fit into this whole pharmaceutical industry? So our main role as a programmer is to get the data into the right shape. And this is important because to license a drug, it needs to have a regulatory submission, and they require the data in a certain shape. And our role is to get it into this shape so it's easiest for them to look at, to kind of, so the submission goes nice and smoothly. And we facilitate this as programmers by the work we do. So a bit about a typical clinical trial. It has 3 main stages. The first would be the study startup. So this would be the design of the study, knowing how you want it to look. You would write a protocol, how the study is going to be conducted, what you want to measure. So for example, you might have a drug that you think is going to lower someone's blood pressure, and you might measure it at the start and at the end and see, has it lowered someone's blood pressure? You'd also write what's called a statistical analysis plan. It would outline the analyses and the methods you want to use and how you're going to conduct this analysis. The next stage would be the study conduct. So this would be where the data is actually collected, the study's monitored, and you look at the timelines for the study, when all the data is going to be collected, when it's going to be ready, when the data set's going to be ready, the output's ready, and kind of stuff like that. And the third stage would be the analysis and reporting stage. So as a programmer, most of my work would sit in this category. So this would involve all that I've talked about before, about getting the data into the right shape, into the right form, and producing the data sets, the tables, figures, and listings to help out with producing the study report. So they're the 3 kind of key stages of a clinical trial, typically. And what does a programmer actually do throughout this trial? So the programmers can be involved in all stages of a drug development. So it might be you're working on an early phase study, looking at the safety of a drug, or you could be working on a later phase study, looking at confirming findings about the drug, looking at the long-term effects of it. And I think it's quite interesting because depending on what study you're working on, you could be looking at completely either end of the spectrum of the drug's development. So that's quite an interesting thing for me. In terms of the actual data you look at, there's a little diagram here for kind of how you see the data start to end. So the raw data would be what's collected at a site. So it might be someone at the site entering the height or the weight that's measured of a subject who's coming for the trial. We would then take this data that's entered into what's called a case report form and turn it into the form of a study data tabulation model. So what this is a standard data set that's required by the regulatory bodies. And that's just the name. SDTM is the name the data set is given. We would then transform this data set into another type of data set called an ADAM, an analysis data model. And this is just another standard data set with a few more standard variables. This is then the data set we'd use to produce the tables, figures, and listings, and the outputs from analysing the data. And all this would quite often be done in SAS, which is the Statistical Analysis System. It's an industry standard program. A lot of the industry would use this. It's not the only one used. For example, R is being used quite a lot and being used more and more, but it is very common to use SAS to do this work. So that's a bit about my role and what does a programmer do. And I'm just going to move on to talk about the recruitment process and how I got into this role. So the benefits of my placement year. I found that it really benefited me knowing what I wanted to do before I actually started looking for graduate roles. So I had the experience, and I think that this made me quite attractive to prospective employers in that I could demonstrate the skills that I had that they were looking for, and also use real life examples from the same industry, which I think was really beneficial to me. And yeah, knowing what I wanted to do going into a graduate role search meant that I could narrow down my search. I didn't have to wonder about, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? I kind of already knew. But when looking for a graduate role, I realized that there's two main paths. There's a statistician and a programmer role in the industry. So on my placement year, there was no programming group. It was just a stats group. So I did a lot of programming as well, but it meant that I got a good balance of stats and programming. So I could I knew which I preferred, which, as you may have guessed, is the programming side of it. So I was searching for graduate roles this time of year. I realised that I wanted to be a programmer as opposed to a statistician. A statistician does require a master's in medical statistics or something similar for most statistician roles. A programmer doesn't really require a master's. In real life, the lines between a statistician and a programmer are a bit more blurred, in that there'll be programmers with a lot of stats knowledge and statisticians with a lot of programming experience. So this is good that you can go to pretty much anyone for some help, and a statistician will be able to give you some programming help, for example, and say they don't quite know what you're talking about, they pretty much always be able to point you in the right direction. So I'm just going to talk a bit more now about the PSI Medical Statistics Taster Day. So PSI is the statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry. And each year, this organisation run what is literally a taster day for the industry. It does what it says in the tin. So you can go in and there'll be presentations about the industry in general, about the different roles on offer, about the different companies in the industry, talks from lots of different people. It's a great opportunity to network, to meet people in the same boat as you that potentially want to get into the pharmaceutical industry, and to meet people already in the industry as well. So they might also be new, they might be a recent graduate, they might be someone who's got 20 years experience in the industry, but it's a great opportunity to meet lots of different people there. And loads and loads of companies, big, small companies, there's stands where you can go and ask questions. So for example, Veramed have a stand there each year, and you could go up to our people at the stand and you could say, what are you looking for? What's your perfect graduate look like? You could ask companies about, do they hire grads? Do they hire grads every year? What's their recruitment process? Anything you might be too scared to ask at an interview or something. It's a nice informal setting to go and ask the questions that you want answering, and yeah, get a real feel for the industry. And PSI is actually how I came across Veramed. So after the taster day, I went away and looked them up online, was on the website, realised that they had a real quality first, right the first time focus, which is something that aligned with the values I had. And then looking at the videos on the website made me feel like it was a great company to work for. I could get a good feel for the company and see that I was somewhere I really did want to work. So it clearly worked out well for me. And yeah, I'd recommend going along if you can. So when I got to Veramed, what we had was the Veramed Graduate Training Program, which did actually start, I guess, before my first day at the company. So during the summer, we had a team building event, which was a day out of the office for the whole team. And us as new graduates went along and engaged in some great team building activities. And it was just a really good chance to get to meet people in an informal setting that made going in the first day that bit less nervous, because you'd already met quite a lot of the team. And then after we did start, there was lots of efforts made for interaction with other members of the team, members that you might not be working with every day. We had short sessions with people to get to know their story, their route into the industry, and a bit about other people in the company, which is really good for helping us settle in quickly. The program itself, it was a 12-week program. It was pretty continuous. There was constantly us learning, improving, asking questions, lots of progress checks. It wasn't just a case of sit and read how to program. The whole graduate training program focused on a really wide range of areas. So one of these was giving us a greater knowledge about the industry. So this was learning more about clinical trials, about how we as a company and us as programmers and statisticians fit into the industry, from people who'd obviously got experience of the industry for, well, a number of years. And it was really good hearing from them and getting a wider grasp of how the industry works. There was, of course, a lot of emphasis on improving our technical skills. So we came in as a group of graduates programming at different levels. So some of us had programmed before, some of us not. I had programmed on my placement year. And what we got was basically a book to work through with lots of exercises, lots of self-checks. And this had no assumed prior knowledge. So we just worked through it and it gave us a good starting point. And some points we get stuck, and then we go and ask for help from whoever was available, and it was a good way to improve our knowledge from talking to different people, and then helped us speak to these different people throughout the company as well, which is really helpful. But it wasn't just the technical skills that the training program focused on. There was a lot of emphasis on the soft skills. So one component of being a good programmer, which you may not think so much, is the importance of communication. So it's not a case of sit there in a corner and program on your own. You have to do a lot of communication with other people you're working with. So it might be updating the study team of where you are. It might be asking another programmer for help, helping someone else out. You need to be able to communicate yourself well. And there was a lot of emphasis on this as part of the training program. There was other things like helping strategies to manage your time, your stress, really little things that just get overlooked sometimes by some people. But for example, a time management skill of making a list, a to-do list at the start of every day, really useful tip that I now use when I come in first thing in the morning. So it was good to have that, the fact that it wasn't just the technical skills that it focused on. We were all given a one-to-one mentor. This was another thing that was really helpful about the program, in that you had someone kind of dedicated to you. They were having lots of progress checks to you, seeing how you're getting on. It was easy to ask questions, technical or otherwise, and it was something that kind of eased the transition into work, that you could ask your mentor something that you're struggling with, that you're worried about, and it meant there was a nice kind of seamless transition into work. And towards the end of the program, we got started on some study work. So this was good because we got to put the stuff we've been doing in SAS, learning how to program, and then putting this into the real world context of the work we'd be doing on studies. So getting started on some simple tables and stuff. But it was great to put what we'd learned into practice. And that's about it for the training program. And just going to have a little summary of what we've talked about so far in the webinar. The pharmaceutical industry, it is really big. I think it's extremely interesting. You really work in potentially in loads of different disease areas, depending on what study you're doing. You're at the kind of forefront of science. You could be developing a drug that, or helping to develop a drug that would change someone's life potentially, which I think is a really exciting prospect and a really good reason why you should get into this industry. And as a programmer, you do really have a big part to play in the development of these drugs. You see the data all the way through from the beginning to the end when you're producing these summaries, and then you make sure it's in the correct shape, that you can do this nice and easily, and play a key role in these regulatory submissions that allow the drugs to be licensed to be sold. And then the other thing that I want to just talk a bit more about is the PSI Medical Statistics Taste Today. So this really is a great opportunity to find out more about different roles, different companies, different routes to the industry. Talk to as many people as you can, ask loads of questions. As I said, Veramed have a stand there each year. We look to recruit graduates each year. So come along, talk to as many people as you can, come and talk to us. And yeah, it's a great day for getting a bit of experience and just a taste of the industry. If you think that it may be for you, it'd be a good chance to ask any questions that you may have. And that is about it from me. So I'll just move on and see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Sean. We've had a couple come in throughout the session. So if there is anybody who wants to ask a question whilst we're just doing this Q&A, you can type your question into the box on the right-hand side. The first one that was actually a question I was going to ask you myself, Sean. Do you know when the PSI Medical Statistics Taster Day is? So
this year it is at the end of February, I believe, but it's best to just check. If you Google it, it'll come up nice and quickly. It's easy to find.
Perfect. Okay, great. So another question that came in earlier, what type of person makes a good statistical programmer?
So I'd say typically this would be someone who thinks logically. You might have to debug a program, go through it with a fine-tooth comb to work out what's going wrong. You'd be quite detail focused. You want to produce high quality work. Attention to detail is really important. And as I mentioned before, good communication skills. you might be having technical conversations 1 minute and then be talking to someone without the same technical knowledge as you the next. So it's good to be able to communicate with lots of different people and communicate effectively, so you can kind of get the job done as best as possible.
Great, okay. You mentioned, or you touched on statisticians and programmers. Is there a lot of similarities between the two? And why would you do a master's to become a statistician over just becoming a programmer instead?
So the difference is, for the kind of more technical and complex analyses, you do really need that extra high level of education of the master's degree. That's not to say as a programmer you won't have any input, as you could have some input into statistical discussions. But yeah, you'd need that high level of education and expertise to be a statistician. We do have another webinar that will be on Veramed's YouTube channel of Tom, one of the other guys here, talking about his experience coming in as a statistician. So if statistician is what people are interested in, I'd recommend looking at that as well.
Great, thank you. And just time for one more question. Somebody's asked, they didn't do a placement year, so they don't have any experience in the industry. Is that a problem, do you think?
I wouldn't say it's a problem, no. So obviously it was good for me that I had the experience in the same industry, but if you can demonstrate that you're really passionate about clinical trials, you know how they work, you're really interested in the industry, and you can demonstrate the key skills like the communication, the being detail orientated, that you can think logically, that you'd be good at programming, you might have some programming experience, they're quite transferable skills, the way that programming is done. You might have programming experience in another language. If you can demonstrate that you have the skills to be a programmer, to be a statistician, then the lack of experience shouldn't count against you too much, because yeah, you can show that you can do it. So yeah, it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. Just a side note, just before we finish, just a member of the team's just done a quick Google for the PSI Medical Statistics Taste today. It takes place on Wednesday, the 28th of February in Leicester, for anyone who is keen to know when that was. So I think we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your time, everybody, and thanks for your presentation, Sean.
Cool, thank you very much.